It was 1994, and Juventus were in an odd place. Off the back of Italia 90, hype around Calcio and Serie A was at an all-time high. The game's biggest superstars were spread across the country, making the league the most competitive and unpredictable. People called it Le Sette Sorelle, meaning the Seven Sisters, the 7 clubs that had a genuine shot at winning the Scudetto. However, I Bianconeri hadn't been one of the successful siblings so far this decade. Despite being a juggernaut of not just Italy, but on the continental scale, things had plateaued in the last few years. Not since the late Platini days of '86 had they won the title, and any time they'd gotten close, Sacchi or Capello's Milan edged them out. Since these were the days that the European Cup had a smaller pool, it was rare that the tournament would see any more than 1 team per country, so Juve had been slumming it in the UEFA Cup, giving them a chance to dust off their cabinet. Many different coaches tried and failed to change their fortunes, most notably Giovanni Trapattoni, who was brought back to replicate his prosperous first spell. But when his 3rd season ended trophyless, Il Trap answered Bayern Munich's calls, creating an opportunity at Delle Alpi. President Vittorio Chiosano had seen his club held to a draw on the western coast only weeks ago by an organised but superstarless Napoli side that had no right stealing their points. Something about the way they played impressed him, and the lawyer made a mental note of the man behind this upset. Marcello Lippi wasn't exactly a household name in Italy at the time. A mediocre playing career had come to an end early, preferring a head start in management, so he headed for the dugout. Following a typical path up the coaching ladder from youth teams to the C tier, then B, until Cesana entrusted him to keep them in the top flight. 1 year there, and then another with Atalanta, earned him the role at the Partenope, where, in the midst of economic turmoil that plagued the San Paolo in the post-Maradona years, the Tuscan held the attention of every single one of his team, teaching that, in the long term, 10 average players doing their jobs well will do better than a world-class team lacking discipline. This was the foundation of his philosophy, validated when they qualified for the UEFA Cup. The crowning achievement that reinforced Chiosano's belief that Lippi was the primary candidate. Giving the biggest job in Italy to a lesser-known journeyman who'd spent only 3 years in Serie A was bound to incite backlash, yet he wasn't fazed by the pressure or reserved in his demands. His first was to bring with him Napoli's skipper, an all-rounded centre-half by the name of Ciro Ferrara, who could help instill the manager's ideas. Then, a couple more defensive signings were made. A tough-tackling 24-year-old Paulo Sousa was lured away from Lisbon, and the man who captained Marseille to French football's only ever European Cup, Didier Deschamps, a reliable and tactically astute leader. Lippi knew there was no need for an overhaul because he had a seriously strong team on his hands. There was a strong old guard, Jurgen Kohler and Massimo Carrera on the back line to keep things steady, and a veteran figure up top who can guarantee the goals in Gianluca Vialli. Yet Juve had the balance right. The 30-year-olds in defence helped initiate their eventual replacements, and Lippi was very keen on using younger prospects, so the likes of Moreno Torricelli and teenager Alessio Tacchinardi became apprentices as they earned their minutes in the black and white. This had also been the case with the number 9 and Fabrizio Ravanelli, who Trapattoni rarely favoured as his singular striker, but under Lippi's regime there was room for him, switching things to a 4-3-3 from the first whistle. Making Juve more goal-oriented wasn't just for show. Save for England, every major league across Europe had awarded 2 points for a win, until at the 1994 World Cup, FIFA upped it to 3. After which the Italian Football Federation followed suit to shift the culture of catenaccio and encourage more attacking play. Lippi was primed to capitalise. Not just that, it was part of his design to make Juventus less dependent on a single player. By this time, Roberto Baggio was established as Italy's greatest star and perhaps the best player on the planet. Maturing from the teen sensation of Fiorentina to the most expensive footballer around, the divine ponytail was otherworldly in his pomp. Nimble and quick with an unrivaled affinity for the ball, he wasn't an athlete but an artist, born to breed footballing beauty, and no one in any sense could touch him. 1994 was the year Baggio's name began to leave a bitter aftertaste. Having rescued his country from embarrassment, Liazzurri took flight on his wings all the way to the Pasadena Rose Bowl, where, as the final taker, Baggio failed to bail them out.
He's missed it, and Brazil win the World Cup. Baggio stays rooted to the spot.
Conceding the World Cup, he was scapegoated, entering the US as Italy's golden boy to leave the man who died standing. The national opinion of the 10 flipped on a dime, lambasted by the media as soon as he set foot on home soil, so Lippi's tough task was made simpler. Before, the plan was simply give Baggio the ball, and after 4 years its efficacy had worn, so scrapping Iltrap's plans that had the 10 as a trequartista and introducing wingers made Juve more unpredictable. Into his debut at the Alpi, Lippi was swapping around his forwards all the time, testing things out to find the winning formula, and the captain was still very much involved, scoring the only goal while hosting Milan, the most crucial 3 points of the season. 2 months deep, in Padua, Lippi witnessed both the genius and his burden, rooting the keeper with a trademark Baggio free kick before being buckled to the floor, writhing in pain. Once again, his right knee had gone. Having been operated on back in the 80s, it was forever a chink in his armour, that in a league this physical was ultimately going to be his undoing. This spared Lippi an awkward conversation or two, leaving him no choice but to get results without Baggio, which wasn't a problem, as a certain 20-year-old had his faith.
Un messaggio a Bettega che nella Juve del futuro ci sei tu.
Ma no, non voglio fare messaggi particolari. Io se vado in campo cerco di dimostrare quello che valgo, cerco di farmi valere. Poi un giorno può andare bene, un altro giorno male. L'importante è mettere impegno e dedizione.
Trapattoni's insistence led to Alessandro Del Piero's purchase in '93, but with Baggio the focal point, there wasn't much room for the similarly styled Trevisano. Started only 4 times, a hat-trick against Parma changed everything, turning heads as he suddenly became a serious prospect. Seeing him up close in training, Lippi knew he was the one to fill in, and just needed to convince the new directors. Luciano Moggi, Roberto Bettega and Antonio Giroud, La Triade. The kid took this into his own hands in their very first match sans Baggio.
Attenzione Del Piero, incredibile gol di Del Piero.
Quality aside, the volleyed chip made it 3-2, proving to the higher-ups that he could be decisive in knocking the Rossineri off their perch. And that was it. Lippi had found the key to the future, with Del Piero and the White Feather flanking Vialli up the centre, while having the world's best player their wildcard. Pinturicchio, as Lippi called him, lingered on the left as an outside attacker with the speed and flair to slip between the lines, open space and whip in a cross or curl into Raggios. Once a bit part player, Rossineri featured more often than anyone else in 94-95, as he'd become one of Serie A's most fearsome strikers, unrelenting and merciless, banging a fifer past Siska Sofia. The interim skipper had hit a rut. Whether the pressure of his record price tag or a personal problem, something wasn't clicking under Trapattoni. but Lippi entered the frame to stoke up Vialli's fire.
Being with Marcello made me feel that I was the best striker in the world.
Optimizing his fitness levels to be faster and stronger, this was the guy they signed. Reminiscent of his Sampdoria days with Mancini, the Nine led the lines and set the standard as Juve came into their own. In an effort to throw off the competition, Lippi changed formation game to game, and the starting 11 was never set in stone, saving his squad from exhaustion and keeping them hungry so everyone was energized season long, mentally and physically. The emphasis was on high pressing to strike on the counter, so the team needed to be fit. There was a posse of Italian midfielders who are essentially runners, while the more technical Paolo Sousa could hold it as the brains of the operation. The high defensive line is always a risky move, and at times it would cost Lippi, but the all-out mentality of the team was intended to minimise draws, going for the win, which was now much more valuable. Their main competition were Lazio and Parma. But as they blazed through the winter months, into spring, topping the table and cruising through the knockouts, the vibe at Delle Alpi was different. It had been 4 months since Baggio last sported the stripes, and by March he was ready to return. So Lippi slotted him right back into the team for a Bianconeri swan song. Rested and redemptive, the divine ponytail reminded us all of the man that lifted the Ballon d'Or. Back as the talismanic artiste, dancing around flying legs and undoing tactical plans on his own, Baggio's masterclass display in Dortmund got them through to a third UEFA Cup final that decade, loudening talks of a treble.
Ho visto adesso che hai abbracciato Baggio e hai detto grande, sì Baggio grande, ma tutti direi, Di Livio stasera, Sosa come sempre.
Sicuramente per fare grande una squadra c'è bisogno sicuramente di grossissimi campioni, c'è bisogno anche di giocatori che facciano di tutto per mettere nelle condizioni ideali questi grossi campioni per esprimersi al massimo.
Lippi gave them the confidence to feel invincible, so having already beaten the Gela Blu on their turf, Juve went into the game overly assured. A Zola Asprilla-led Parma edged them out across the two-legged final, handing a sobering blow to start a hectic conclusion to Juve's campaign. 4 days later, the sides met again in the league, and the pain was still fresh. The pendulum had swung away from Lippi, who had been outmanoeuvred by Nevio Scala, keeping their triumvirate quiet. This couldn't happen again, as Juve were 7 points clear and 10 if they won, which guaranteed them the Scudetto. Delle Alpi was electric that Sunday, filled to the rafters with fans who demanded payback, and wanting to paint over that bad memory, they showed why they were the favourites. From the first whistle, the defence was unbreachable, midfield dominant and attack expressive, with the captain at his playmaking best, pulling the strings with pinpoint passing into the red-hot strikers. Once they got one, it was all about getting another, and by the 70th minute the game was killed. Lippi had responded with a display to prove themselves as the best team in Italy, rightfully awarded with his first ever trophy, a 23rd Scudetto for Juventus.
Fare dediche è troppo facile, no?
9 years since their last, an aging group was suddenly revitalised by an ambitious, fresh-faced leader with a philosophy that values every member equally.
The whole is greater than the sum of the parts.
Doubling down on their revenge that June, they saw out the campaign with another pair of matches against Parma for the Coppa Italia finale. The crowned champions knew how to beat them now, and again holding on to their clean sheet, La Vecchia Signora made it a rare domestic double.
Hanno appena sottolineato, tu hai proibito di fare le prime donne, ma consegnare una squadra. Una squadra, un gruppo.
This feat is hard enough as is, but to do it in Italy in the 90s, at the end of your first season, Lippi's influence couldn't be understated, yet took nothing away from his class of 95.
Allora sì, ne hai fatte tante quest'anno, però questo è il capolavoro.
Perché questi ragazzi se lo meritano, perché hanno fatto in questo ambiente qua venire a vincere una gara come questa non è semplice.
Senti, non ti ho mai visto così emozionato come in questa circostanza.
Tante volte e
no, non così, non così.
Vedrai ancora, mi auguro. Ciao.
As a character, he was always fairly reserved, speaking to the press eloquently and never losing his cool. Lippi, often compared to Paul Newman, gave off the ideal look for a coach. Under the look and away from the cameras, he was strict, demanding as close to perfection as possible on the training pitch, and could easily blow his lid when players fall short of the mark. Not a man to prolong celebrations, he was straight back to work, figuring out how to maintain this standard. The difficult part was done, so holding on to his men was more important than marquee signings, and ridding of the dead wood took precedence. Told his place was no longer guaranteed and a pay cut was needed, Baggio was sweet-talked into a Milan move by Silvio Berlusconi, who shelled out nearly €10 million for the 28-year-old. Cole's departure brought their income to around 13 million, which with all the other fees that came their way left Lippi a healthy sum to splurge on names from within the league, prioritising experience. From an informed Gianluca Pessotto at 25 to Sampdoria's veteran Pietro Vecchivod, 10 years his senior, it was a spot-on summer window, keeping the balance, fortifying the squad while hurting their competition. The rotation policy was huge for Lippi, preserving their freshness but also to avoid injury, which was a massive risk given the intensity of their training. This didn't mean the coach wouldn't have preferences. Besides the front three, whose chemistry grew stronger game by game, his midfield trio was also established. Voted Juve's Player of the Year, Sousa was the fulcrum, sometimes dropping deeper for a wide scope of things and controlling the build-up. Deschamps was similar in style to the six, looking to collect from the back line as a more horizontal holding midfielder, to contrast the energetic, forward-thinking Antonio Conte. They had competition like Lombardo and Vladimir Jugovic, Lippi's priciest buys, and the ever-consistent Angelo Di Livio to come off the bench, but these were almost set in stone, as were those behind them. Ferrara, knowing him the best and vice versa, was an extension of the coach's right arm, as the gritty yet poised commander who radiated the mentality Lippi wanted them all to have.
We felt like our duty was to really be on top of our opponents. I remember looking at them thinking, I'm not scared, you must be scared.
Torricelli and Carrera had been around for a while and were both very competent, adaptable defenders who could do it all in a zonal marking system. Crossing the Turin divide, Pessotto was a risk-free purchase, slotting in at left-back with no issues or need for adjustment. Il Professorino reinforced the rear guard's composure while giving them added mobility. Vecchivod turned out to be the bargain of the season. €250,000 was hugely discounted, with him having just turned 36, and he wasn't the same man who terrified forwards in the 80s.
Vecchivod would mark me, who was evil, nasty, fast, aggressive, horrible to play against.
But he wasn't far from it. It was an old school defence, a concrete base just as the manager wanted. In the new year, a Vialli tap-in was all it took for the Supercoppa Italiana, which looked like the only domestic trophy they were picking up that year. The Coppa Italia was out of the picture by October, and they were barely keeping up in the title race. However, a different story was being told on the continental level. Comfortably advancing, they found form as the debuting team of the newly formatted Champions League. The rigorous training schedule meant they were leaps and bounds fitter than any side they faced, relentless in their running, leaving the opposition battered. The man responsible is the late Gianpiero Ventrone, or the Marine as the players knew him. Formerly of the San Marco Elite Corps, he took fitness training to an uncharted extreme, pushing the players beyond their limits. He preempted the next era of the game as a sport only for true athletes, which put Juventus on a different pedestal, forging alongside Lippi the spirit that would take the team to the top and keep them there.
Penso che tutti quanti noi abbiamo forse un solo merito, quello di aver dato lucentezza ad una carrozzeria comunque già di una grande Ferrari.
Inheriting the 10, Del Piero didn't feel the weight of the number and sought to make it his own as the new jewel of Juve. certainly the outstanding talent, he was as two-footed as they come, blessed with a delicate touch and a unique understanding of the game. Moving freely as the so-called 9.5, he discovered his own speciality. Splitting Madrid's wall for his 6th goal in Europe that year, the 21-year-old led them through to the semis, where they encountered a serious Nantes outfit. A cushy 2-0 gave the Italians a lead to take to France, where the Canaries gave them a run for their money, but the captain was the star this time, claiming their first once more with a slick punt, and then into the second 45, setting up Sousa, who stormed through to seal the deal and win the Bianconeri a place in the final. By then, the Rossineri had pulled clear, and the Big Ears became their saving grace, so Lippi got to studying, spending the weeks on the lead-up meticulously looking over footage and briefing the boys as they prepared to face the holders. Louis van Gaal had put together something extraordinary in Amsterdam. While their competition spent on stars, Ajax bred their own, raising them under the influence of Cruyff, so all they knew was total football. Their confidence was boosted last summer, when with an average age of 23, they dethroned Milan to become the greatest side in Europe. Both coaches used a 4-3-3. While Van Gaal's was used to dominate possession, Lippi's was more pragmatic, staying compact in their lines but pressing to force an error. It was a perfect battle of styles, one that the bookies had going in favour of the holders, but Il Mister didn't mind being the underdog. He kept his dressing room focused, blocking out the noise of the press, and so upon arriving at Rome's Olimpico, the challengers were certain they'd be taking the cup home. It had been 11 years since their last. In the mid-80s glory days of Platini, Rossi, Boniek and co, the narrow win over Liverpool gave Juventus its brightest moment on what became their darkest day.
And it was the pressure of movement down towards the running track which resulted in the wall giving way and people being pinned underneath it.
The club needed a fresh memory to help the healing process, and the '96 final gave just that opportunity. Typically Gilarossi, the stadium was in Bianconeri colours that day, and as things started, you could see it helped them and hindered Ajax. Unsettled by the ferocious pressing of Conte and Deschamps, Van Gaal's men were shaky, and the white feather capitalised.
Attenzione, c'è un po' di imprecisione, Ravanelli, attenzione, goal!
These first 12 minutes were flawless, but as the tension relaxed, the game opened up. Some close shaves here and there, the lead looked secure going into the break, until their talisman, Jari Litmanen, squeezed in a rebound in minute 41. No matter what, Lippi remained stoic on the sideline. He believed in his tactics and trusted those on the field to carry them out. Even when Vialli put a likely winner the wrong side of the post, their attitude stayed, and the midfield changes kept the energy into extra time. The deadlock also endured this added half hour, so spot kicks would call it, allowing one player to step into the light. With the legendary Dino Zoff his predecessor, Angelo Peruzzi had to fight to make a name for himself, but in the capital he'd had the performance of a lifetime. Not built to guard the sticks, the keeper's 5'11" stocky frame didn't hinder him as he read the game well and was springy across the line. It served him well in the shootout, throwing off Ajax's first taker to put it down the middle, and then guessing correctly for their fourth, leaving the score 3-2, with Juve having beaten a young Van der Sar every time. The substitute Jugovic made the long walk as the one with the opportunity to finish it. Everything was vindicated. The upstarts were now superstars, the veterans became legends, and Lippi was a mastermind. The captain hoisted the trophy that had escaped him 4 years prior to mark an iconic image in Bianconeri lore, as Juventus were now champions of Europe.
Vialli and Juventus. Juventus lift the European Cup.
This was the turning point for Lippi's Juventus. Now they'd won it all, there was a sense of closure during the celebrations at the end of 2 long seasons. And instead of resting on his laurels, the coach was wise enough to know a redesign was the only way to keep the element of surprise. Ravanelli, their top scorer that year, had been critical to Lippi's style and would only leave the pitch knackered. But the coach had something else in mind, so he shipped him off to the Premier League along with Vialli, where the pair became cult heroes of Middlesbrough and Chelsea respectively. Vjekevod, who defied the laws of nature by playing every minute of the final, was now 37 and had outlived his usefulness to Lippi, who was looking at the long term. One shocking exit was that of Sousa, who visited the yellow wall of Dortmund after being dropped. The midfielder's impact had taken a massive hit when teams realised that he was the linchpin and began to man-mark him.
They don't want to relate in me in the future for my knee or whatever they have it in mind.
Lippi wanted an injection of youth, so for the departed strikers he ushered in 3 younger goalscorers who he'd seen firsthand. Nicola Amoruso from Padova, Christian Vieri of Atalanta and Lazio's Alan Boksic. Bolstering the back line, he again recruited from Italian clubs, with Mark Giuliano and Paolo Montero, neither of whom had hit 25. All that was left was a replacement for the Portuguese, so the scouts looked further afield. That March, Bordeaux had staged a comeback against Milan, and Michel Platini made a note of the orchestrator behind it, the eye-catching number 7 who'd overran a midfield of Marcel Desailly and Patrick Vieira. He'd passed the name onto the Agnelli family, who owned Juventus, and it trickled down to the board, who pulled together a modest €3.5 million for the 23-year-old. The name, of course, was Zinedine Zidane. Beyond Turin, people were very cynical about the skinny Marseille native. Not only was he scapegoated in France that summer for their Euros elimination, but many higher-ups had turned him down, like the Blackburn chairman Jack Walker.
And Jack said, why do we need Zinedine Zidane? We've got Tim Sherwood.
Yeah, he liked to tipple, didn't he, Jack?
The culture shock hit Zidane like a tidal wave. Juve were renowned for their standard of training, and for a newcomer to not just the club, but the country, the Frenchman couldn't keep up. As the deep-lying playmaker, he couldn't match Serie A's intensity and was lacking on the defensive side. From his lean build to awareness, he didn't fit. Everyone else had hit the ground running, and the plan to age down was working a treat. But Lippi was still trying to figure out Zidane.
Perché mi volevano fare tutti fuori, anche i tifosi, E quindi quello che mi ha fatto del bene è Marcello, perché lui mi ha detto tu rimani qua. Loro possono dire quello che vuoi, tu rimani qua e vincerà qua la Juve.
Everything changed when Conte's knee gave out, forcing the coach to alter his setup into a 4-4-2 for the Derby d'Italia. Partnering Deschamps, Zidane was liberated.
Poi Zidane trova un gol favoloso e raddoppio della Juve.
It was the light bulb moment for Lippi, who kept him at the diamond's tip where his creative flair was on full display, feeding the now 2-man strike force. With a Rolodex of 5 different forwards, each were on their toes and hungry for minutes, so even with Del Piero's mid-season injury, Lippi had 4 top options. The strength of the squad was frightening. Montero had slotted in at the back like he was born to be there, acting as the aggressor. His speed and energy was almost like they'd traded in Vjekevod for a younger model, and alongside Ferrara he couldn't fail. With the fullbacks figured out, as well as even their reserves, and Deschamps sweeping up any danger, this was now deemed the world's toughest defence. Across Europe, everyone knew the worst thing would be to go 1 down against Juve, because their organisation and work rate was second to none. It happened so many times, a simple 1-0 win to collect the points and move on. It wasn't about panache or showmanship, but efficiency. Exactly that mindset won them the 1996 Intercontinental Cup that winter, shutting out a riveting River Plate side all game, relying on one of their stars to steal it at the death. For proof of how much of a nightmare they were to face, look no further than the Super Cup against PSG in January of '97. Humiliating the Parisians 6-1 at the Parc des Princes, then putting another 3 past them in Italy, the Kings of Europe became the best team on the planet without barely breaking a sweat. They could do this against anyone, hammering the nail in the coffin of the Rossineri's era of dominance with another 6-1 thrashing at the San Siro, signalling the passing of the mantle.
It was his second, Juve's 6, and the heaviest home defeat in Milan's history.
While leading the league charge at home, they were finding it even easier abroad. Now holders, they had an aura about them which struck fear, giving Juve the upper hand before a ball was even kicked. Conceding once in 6 group games while scoring 11, they got past Rosenborg of Norway unscathed to draw a vengeful Ajax for a place in the final. The contest wasn't so tight this time. Van Gaal had lost key players and Juve were even better than last year, with Zidane amping up the genius dial to give a self-proclaimed performance of a lifetime. They had a 4-goal margin by the closing whistle, even without their best player on the pitch, and the majority felt it wasn't even worth playing the final. This time, Juve would be favourites. Ottmar Hitzfeld's Dortmund were well aware of the opinions flying around at the time and couldn't really disagree.
Klar war, dass wir absolute Außenseiter waren. Damals war Juventus mit Abstand die beste Mannschaft in der Welt. Sie hatten
Juve were officially champions of Italy for a second year running, while Die Schwarz-Gelben were almost 10 points behind Bayern in the Bundesliga. While the Italians took this hype in their stride, the lack of belief in the Germans relieved them of all pressure by the time they arrived at Munich's Olympiastadion. Del Piero wasn't fit to start, so Vieri and Boksic spearheaded the old lady, a pairing that seemed to bring the best out of each other. Hitzfeld identified the 21 as their danger man, so he gave Paul Lambert clear instructions to keep him quiet. After about 30 minutes, Juve felt powerless, trying to break down a 3-back without their playmaker, and Dortmund's counter-attacks kept catching them out. All of a sudden, they were 2 down, and when Zidane hit the post, then Vieri's response was written off. It felt like this wasn't their night. Pinturicchio came on to up the press and do something special to get them back in it. Yet, destiny had already picked a side, and 16 seconds into his appearance, a 20-year-old Lars Ricken caught Peruzzi in no man's land to put Dortmund on Europe's throne. Juve were shell-shocked. Their mortality had been exposed, and the bitterness of defeat was extra sharp, given half the Dortmund team were former Bianconeros. Perhaps Lippi underprepared, perhaps his boys were cocky. It doesn't change the fact this final was winnable. The returning Scudetto wasn't enough for Lippi, and another summer of reshuffling was to come. Vieri was offered 3.5 million lira a year by Atletico Madrid, but Moggi & Co wouldn't go higher than 2, so Bobo said bye-bye. Boksic went back to Lazio with little protest, followed by Jugovic, while 2 other regulars, Lombardo and Porini, exited Italy altogether. Again, Lippi restocked. Empoli's Alessandro Bilendelli joined the defensive line as a versatile fullback. Fabio Pecchia of Napoli for the midfield, and super sub striker Daniel Fonseca from Roma. They were in the range of 1 to 5 million euros each, but Vieri's sale had brought in almost 18, so they had the funds for a serious replacement. In Bergamo, a 23-year-old marksman was single-handedly keeping Atalanta afloat, scoring 24 of their 44 goals last season. He was the hottest striker in the league and deserved a spot in its best team.
Questa è una squadra che deve sempre vincere, non ha paura di sbagliare.
No, assolutamente, perché è giusto avere delle responsabilità. Io già quando andai all'Atalanta, dopo essere stato a Parma, avevo grosse responsabilità perché sapevo che dovevo fare gol e perché i miei gol dovevano contribuire alla salvezza dell'Atalanta. Ci sono riuscito, ho vinto la classifica dei cannonieri a 23 anni e penso di essermi tolto tante soddisfazioni. Adesso inizia una nuova avventura molto stimolante e spero di ripetere la grande stagione che ho fatto a Bergamo.
Filippo Inzaghi was welcomed to Turin and was an instant success. Accompanying a fully fit Del Piero and ahead of Zidane, the environment was dream-worthy for a poacher. With a double on his debut, Inzaghi flaunted his God-given instincts as they collected another Supercoppa. Pippo had arrived. His sidekick had endured a rough few months, but at first sight after the summer, he appeared more muscular, clearly putting in extra work at the gym to avoid any more serious injuries. The same could be said for the 21, who'd come to the north a slender, lanky kid, but was now a lot more imposing, which only made Zidane more impossible to tackle. This trio gelled so easily from their opening match together. The midfielder's physicality and elegance, from his magnetic first touch to ingenious slipped passes, made the newcomer's job all that much easier.
Dalla sinistra in mezzo il gol, arriva il gol. Pippo Inzaghi.
They appreciated each other's unique ability. While Zidane was a phenomenon on the ball, Inzaghi was special for what he did off of it, waiting all game, anticipating and timing runs in behind.
Inzaghi sul tiro fuori gioco, Inzaghi, rete!
Alex was his second striker, so the service was world-class no matter who gave it. But Inzaghi was also his perfect foil, distracting defenders for Pinturicchio to have a go himself. He had the qualities of a winger, playmaker and striker all in one, leaving markers in his dust, setting up his teammates and beating the keeper like a true 9. Conte was back and now bore the armband as Lippi was finally able to field his best 11. Going into the winter break unbeaten in Serie A and edging through to the European knockouts thanks to a critical goal against the Red Devils, they were following familiar footsteps but weren't convincing enough for Il Mister. So, that December, he took a chance on a maverick. Milan's history with the Dutch made it a no-brainer for Ajax's Edgar Davids to leave his hometown for the San Siro, but it wasn't a marriage made in heaven. Inside an 18-month toxic fling, Davids had broken his leg, built up a reputation for wild nights of violence, and been labelled a rotten apple by Billy Costacurta. He was steadily undoing his trophy-laden career in Amsterdam, yet Lippi had seen him live too many times to believe anything but his eyes. He vowed to harness the tenacity of the pit bull and invigorate his midfield. Described by the coach as his one-man engine room, the Dutchman dealt with the dirty work, responding well to Lippi, who had boosted his confidence after a miserable time in Milan. Another glorious duo was born as he became the yin to Zidane's yang. A polar opposite on face value, Davids was a ball of adrenaline, ready to get ugly if the game calls for it, while his counterpart was the maestro behind the game's tempo, never in a hurry, embodying footballing grace. Yet their understanding was mutual. Davids ran so Zidane could walk. This is when Lippi decided to again modify the formation, starting with a 3-man back line, 4 in the mid, and then the trio up top. Seeming to have unlimited drive, Davids was like 2 players in one and completely freed Zidane of any defensive duties. Juve were looking unstoppable. The only competition was Inter, led by their peaking fenomeno and Djorkaeff, who'd handed them a first loss 14 games in.
Rammarico di aver perso una partita, direi immeritatamente, però abbiamo perso una battaglia. La guerra è ancora molto lunga.
This was their strength. They just shook it off and upped the levels to then win all of their next 5 games and reclaim pole position. They could shift gears at any point and just dismantle a team, wearing them down and picking them apart as they did Milan that March or Feyenoord at the Alpi. The concern came from those times they didn't show up, like the return leg in Rotterdam or visit to Florence. However, these losses were few and far between, and for the 4th straight year under the smoker, major honours were in their crosshairs. An Inzaghi hat-trick in Kiev steered them to a semis battle with AS Monaco, where another triple almost decided it, coming from Del Piero's wand of a right foot. Zizou topped it off with a neat finish around his nation's number 1 for back-to-back 4-1 triumphs in the competition, and despite another scare at Stade Louis II, their place in the final was confirmed. This would be their 3rd Champions League final in a row, but before travelling to Amsterdam, they had a chance to wrap up the title. It had been 9 years since the Scudetto had last come to the blue side of Milan, so Inter, 1 point behind, dropped by the Alpi with a fire in their belly beyond compare. It was the nation's Footballer of the Year versus the leagues, and was bound to be decided by one of the two. 20 minutes in, the Bianconero staked his claim for the Gazzetta headlines that week. Ronaldo kept pushing, but the fort was held by any means necessary, and when Juliano's body check on the Brazilian was ignored by the ref, a cloud of controversy darkened the 1-0 home win that ultimately clinched it for the holders.
This afternoon, Latin emotions ran so high that rival supporters picked up where the players left off. The irate deputy was escorted from the chamber and Parliament was suspended.
4 years, 3 titles, Lippi had made Juventus Italy's dominant force once again, etching them into the chronicles of Calcio forever. It also gave them a respite ahead of the big game, resting a handful of them for the last league match. There was no one out and no risk of injury. It was all about the plan of action. Much like most of their matches, Juve were heavily favoured. Real Madrid were a fiasco domestically. Their campaign had collapsed after Christmas, slipping down to 4th in La Liga, yet they'd only lost once in their 10 games on the road to the final. The Madridistas had been waiting 32 years for a shot at number 7, but the Bianconeri felt it was owed to them by now, and the starting period reflected that. They probed and poked but couldn't get it over the line. Still, the intensity was there and a goal was surely on its way. Los Blancos jabbed back as the half came to a close, with Raul missing the best chance yet. The second half followed a similar theme. Old pals Davids and Seedorf were trading blows, and Lippi's half-time words had recharged them. Still, something was off. Inzaghi put wide an effort from the sort of point-blank range he was known to punish, and the pitbull punted what could have been an excellent individual goal right into the arms of Bodo Illner. Their chances became less regular when Redondo and Karumbu double-teamed Zidane to cut off supply lines, like Lambert had last year, and it started to feel like the Dortmund game, especially with what happened next.
Roberto Carlos Mijatovic, gol, ha marcado el Madrid, ha marcado Mijatovic, minuto 21.
Having packed champagne for the trip, La Vecchia Signora were left humbled and baffled at what had gone so wrong at this stage in the last 2 years. Maybe it was preordained for the Spaniards, who kicked on to become synonymous with the Champions League. But when Manolo Sanchis got his hands on the big ears, it felt like these past few years had been for nothing, and Juventus entered a footballing depression.
Abbiamo giocato male, abbiamo sbagliato, purtroppo. L'ultima partita della stagione l'abbiamo giocata al di sotto nettamente delle nostre possibilità.
Non esiste una sindrome da finale?
Alla seconda. Ne abbiamo vinte 7-8 di finali fra Coppa dei Campioni, Coppa Intercontinentale, Supercoppa Europea, Supercoppa Italiane. Sono finali questi, pure le abbiamo vinte.
Lippi felt his cycle was over. In spite of all the heartbreaks, he'd rebuilt a dormant superpower, created legends, and left an indelible mark on the club. They'd been set up perfectly for a new coach to come in and do what Lippi couldn't, but the board had other ideas. Moggi, Bettiger and Giroud believed he had more to give and refused his resignation. Things had already been getting tense between he and the hierarchy, but it started flaring up again in the summer of '98. One of the big blowouts came from the sale of Vieri, who after a Pichichi-winning goal-per-game season with Los Rojiblancos scored 5 for Gli Azzurri at the World Cup to become essentially the most informed striker on the planet and vindicate Lippi's anger at letting him go. Nevertheless, there was still a year on his contract and they trapped him at the Alpi to squeeze all they could from a man who didn't want to be there. Still hungover from Amsterdam, a very modest transfer window and the Supercoppa defeat to Lazio was a hint of the toxic air at Delle Alpi. Injuries plagued them too. Firstly Uliano, then Pesotto, but the one that changed their fate was Del Piero's. Rupturing the anterior and posterior ligaments in his left knee, his season was written off by week 8, and so was Juve's. Zidane, officially the world's greatest after his heroics with Les Bleus, couldn't get things going, and at times let his infamous temper get the best of him. The same thing happened with Davids, and Inzaghi's output fell off a cliff. They were 8th going into Christmas, by which point Lippi had let it fly publicly that he wanted to coach the Nerazzurri. It wasn't until February that La Triade obliged him. Fittingly, it was their old enemies Parma to do the deed of convincing Moggi, putting 4 past Peruzzi for a 9th loss in 5 months.
Ho cercato di tirare fuori per tutto quello che mi era possibile, però in questo momento questa è una squadra che è troppo fragile caratterialmente, troppo fragile mentalmente. Non riesce ad esprimersi. Allora se il problema sono io, ho deciso di dare le dimissioni. Mi prendo tutte le responsabilità e vi saluto. Arrivederci.
Decisioni irrevocabili.
That was his last game in charge, and Carlo Ancelotti saw out the season, nearly salvaged by an epic semi-final with Manchester United, but Roy Keane's masterclass denied them any silverware that year. Lippi touched down in Milan that summer to start a new chapter under Massimo Moratti, reuniting with a few old friends. With this talent at his disposal, Inter was set up for Scudetti, and thus was any coach's dream job. However, after 5 years in Turin, the choice of their rivals was an obvious way to spite his captives. It marked his record, yet took nothing away from his tenure.
Comunque Marcello, ti vogliamo bene, grazie di tutto, è stato meraviglioso.
How Lippi transformed a hopeless group on the brink of collapse into a global force to be reckoned with. The most feared team of the 90s.
Juventus qualified.
Yeah, Juventus qualified.
It had been a magical time for all things bianconeri, but all good things must come to an end, and as the dust settled in both camps, it seemed the divorcees were happy on their new paths, for the time being.
I think there were a few teams that we played against that weren't clean. I came off a pitch against an Italian team, that's not right.
È l'accusa a mezzo stampa lanciata con la convinzione che il calcio deve uscire dalle farmacie e dagli uffici finanziari se vuole tornare a essere sport.
They are suspected of what? Of using stimulants, of using doping?
I think so, yes.